Confidential Book 4051 30 U-501 Interrogation of Survivors October 1941 Naval Intelligence Division Admiralty SW-1 The following report is compiled from information derived from prisoners of war. The statements made cannot always be verified. They should therefore not be accepted as facts unless they are definitely stated to be confirmed by information from other sources. Table of Contents. Section 1. Introductory Remarks. Section 2. Crew of U-501. 3. Early History of U-501. 4. First and Last Cruise of U-501. 5. Sinking of U-501. 6. Details of U-501. Appendix. List of crew of U-501. Interrogation of Survivors of U-501, a 740-ton U-boat sunk at about 0300 on Thursday, 11th September 1941 in position 62 degrees by 55 north and 37 degrees by 50 west. Section 1. Introductory Remarks. U-501 was sunk on 11th September 1941, 15 days after the capture of U-570. Prisoners from both U-boats were interrogated at the same time, and it was decided that all general information should be collated for publication in the more important report, namely that on the interrogation of prisoners from U-570. Therefore, this report on U-501 contains only such information as concerned this U-boat. Section 2. Crew of U-501. Of the 6 officers, 15 petty officers, and 26 men forming the complement of U-501, only the engineer officer, 4 petty officers, and 2 ratings had ever made a war cruise prior to U-501's first and last cruise. Most of the men were very young, the youngest being 17 years of age, hastily and most inadequately trained, and almost completely inexperienced. They expressed their disillusionment regarding their life and active service in a U-boat, which had been described to them in the glowing lies of the recruiting authorities. When questioned as to their opinions on the progress of the war and on the future, they expressed the usual propaganda arguments. It was evident that their morale was sustained entirely by the increasing flow of statements and prophecies pumped into them by the German press and radio. It is also known that the officers were charged with the periodic instruction of the crew with the object of maintaining a correct political attitude among the men. This insecure basis of prisoners' morale did not stand up to active service emergencies, the officers and most of the men surrendering without much resistance, and subsequently indicating their relief at being out of the war. A very few of the older petty officers were rather bitter regarding this matter, and stated that, had they had better leadership, they would have put up a fight and would have had a good chance of escaping from the British warships. Every man in U-501 had been repeatedly lectured on the subjects of security and interrogation by the British in the event of capture. They had been systematically and thoroughly warned of various dangers in this respect, and many of the younger ratings thought that they would be shot on capture by the British, although the captain denied that he had ever circulated such rumors. The mental outlook of the crew was uniformly and fanatically Nazi. The attitude of the older petty officers was polite and formal, and they were in every way better types than the junior ratings. The physical standard was high, although very few men not as fit as the majority, had been included in the crew because of their naval experience. The captain, Corvette Capitaine Commander Hugo Forster, lately 37 years of age, joined the Navy in 1923 and had until recently served in surface ships. In 1936, as a Captain Lieutenant, or Lieutenant Commander, he commanded the torpedo boat Tiger of the 3rd Torpedo Boat Flotilla. In 1937 and 1938, he held an appointment in the Home Defense Department. He was transferred to the cruiser Blücher and was serving as Corvette Capitaine, or Commander, in that ship when she was sunk in Oslo Fjord in April 1940. It was stated that he had later commanded a transport ship for some time. He was transferred fairly recently to U-boats and took a shortened U-boat course. He refused to go into any details of his recent career, but it was established that the first and last cruise of U-501 was also his first and last cruise as captain of a U-boat, although he may have been on a war cruise in another U-boat under instruction as a prospective captain. His lack of experience, his cowardice, and other defects were bitterly criticized by his officers and men, some of whom went as far as to threaten to take vengeance into their own hands should Forster not be adequately punished by court-martial after the war. According to his crew, Forster not only surrendered without a fight, but subsequently thought solely of his own skin, and not of the fate of his ship, nor of the lives of his men, 11 of whom were drowned. He was the first to desert his U-boat, and the only man to jump from her to the British corvette without even getting wet, let alone having to swim for some time before being rescued. Later, when visiting his men, he offered his hand to the chief quartermaster, a man of 14 years' service in the German Navy, who refused to shake hands with him. Forster's own behavior did not coincide with the attitude towards duty and death which he had frequently and dramatically enjoined on his crew during the earlier, calm period of their cruise. Some of his men felt that he had not personally proved his favorite dictum to the effect that the Germans know how to die. His profession of loyalty to the Nazi regime appeared to be based on a shrewd calculation of the prospects offered by such adherence, and not by ideological or patriotic considerations. Although not really of the officer class, Forster had acquired a certain veneer, but his inferiority complex resulted in overcompensation, which took the form of an unpleasant insistence on the privileges of his rank and imagined importance. He spoke some English and a little French. He was married, and his wife lived in Berlin. According to his men, he was an intimate friend of the Vice Admiral U-boats Dönitz. The first lieutenant, Oberleutnant zur See Werner Elbring, aged 27 years, was a native of the Rhineland and had joined the Navy in 1934. He was transferred to the German Air Force in 1936 and remained in that service until a recent date, when he was transferred back to the Navy and drafted to U-boats after a short course. In spite of his lack of U-boat experience, Elbring boasted that he could have obtained command of a U-boat of his own had he not wished to gain experience of active service conditions and strategy before accepting the responsibility of command. He was an interesting man, moderately educated, speaking quite good English and some French, but rather bombastic and narrow-minded. He was an ardent physical culturalist and a bully. He was married. The junior officer, Lieutenant zur See Sub-Lieutenant Hans Sittenfeld, 24 years of age, was born on 23 July 1917. He had spent most of his life in Kiel. His father, Erich Sittenfeld, was a U-boat captain of the Great War and was drowned off the Irish coast when in command of U-45 on 12th September 1917, 7 weeks after the birth of his son. Prisoner joined the Navy in 1937 and had not long been in U-boats. He was on his first active service cruise. He was better educated than the other officers, spoke a little English, showed some literary, musical, and artistic tastes, and appeared to be very fond of sailing and other open-air pursuits. His critical and appreciative discernment were a welcome change from the usual conversation of German naval officers. He gave the impression of being genuinely patriotic, accepting the Nazi regime as the only means of securing and maintaining his country her rightful place among nations. These activities of Hitler have, in Sittenfeld's opinion, been dictated by circumstances. He thinks that the British overrate both the importance and the competence of Goebbels. Prisoner's wife was said to be doing clerical work in some naval establishment at Kiel. The engineer officer, Oberleutnant Engineer Lieutenant Gerhard Schiemann, aged 27 years, was a native of East Prussia. He entered the Navy in 1934 and joined the U-boat branch in 1937. In 1938, he became engineer officer in a U-boat of the U-boat flotilla Los. It is believed that he served formerly in U-16 and U-22. Although an ardent Nazi and a blind worshipper of Hitler, he was quite a pleasant person when discussing general topics. He was fond of sailing and riding. He was married, his wife living in Hamburg. The other two officers were young midshipmen who joined the Navy on 1st December 1939. Apart from their training, they had no naval experience and had volunteered for U-boats. Their suitability for this branch of the service was being tested. They were both typical products of the Hitler Youth Organization, fanatical, stupid, conceited, and poorly educated. Section 3. Early History of U-501. It was established that U-501 was the first of a series of 740-ton U-boats built at the Deutsche Werk Finkenwerder, Hamburg. Owing to the rigid security measures enforced in all German building yards, the prisoners had no idea as to the approximate date of the laying down of U-501. They stated, however, that she was a Type 9C U-boat, and that her building number, Werftnummer, was 287. She was known to the dockyard workers only by that number. The later identity number, U-501, was allocated only after the U-boat had left the building yard. At the end of November or early December 1940, the first members of her future crew were drafted to stand by the U-boat during the final stages of construction. At that time, according to prisoners, there was one other unfinished U-boat, namely U-502, on the same slip, and 2 or 3 others under construction in the yard. They added that 2 U-boats were usually built on each slip. She appears to have been launched at the end of December 1940 or early in January 1941. U-501 carried out her acceptance trials on 16th April 1941 and was formally commissioned on 30th April 1941. Prisoners said that when they left Hamburg, 5 or 6 U-boats were being built at the Deutsche Werft, of which 2, U-502 and U-503, had already been launched, while the others were almost ready for launching. Prisoners believed that about 15 to 20 U-boats were now under construction at this building yard. On 10th May 1941, U-501 proceeded through the Kiel Canal to Kiel, where she lay at the Lützow jetty with one other 740-ton U-boat. NID note: the Lützow jetty is in the torpedo boat harbor south of the Holtenau entrance to the Kiel Canal. After about 14 days, U-501 went to Gotenhafen, where torpedo trials were carried out, air torpedoes being used. No other U-boat took part in these practices, although 3 other U-boats, of which one was a 740-tonner, were said to have been there at the same time. Danzig and Hela were also visited. U-501 then returned to Kiel and later to Hamburg, arriving at the latter port during the second week of June 1941, or a little earlier. A refit was then carried out involving a number of alterations, which included the moving of the bilge water lead in order to obtain better access to the bilges. 4 of the 10 upper deck containers for torpedoes were removed. Prisoners stated that U-503 was then still in Hamburg, but that U-502 had already left to do her trials. After 3 weeks, U-501 went back through Kiel Canal to Kiel, arriving there about the end of June 1941. U-501, accompanied by a 500-ton U-boat, left Kiel and proceeded through the Great Belt to Horten on the Oslo Fjord. She was said to have stayed at Horten for about a week. Prisoners stated that they saw 2 or 3 other U-boats there. U-568, U-569, and U-571 were mentioned in this connection, but the statements were not confirmed. From Horten, U-501 went to Trondheim, breaking her journey for 3 hours at Kristiansand. She was to have been in company with a 500-ton U-boat, believed by prisoners to have been either U-84 or U-87, and to have been protected at the beginning and at the end of this journey by escort vessels. At Trondheim, 2 more upper deck containers for torpedoes were removed, leaving only 4 of the original 10. Repairs to a projecting rod which acted as a protection to the hydroplane were carried out. The Kingstons were also overhauled. A 500-ton U-boat was in dock at the same time. During this time, the crew lived in Huascaran, a 7,000-ton liner of the Hamburg-Amerika line. U-501 was said to have carried out torpedo firing and diving practices in company with several other U-boats. The U-boats went out each day for trials and returned in the evening. The greatest depth to which U-501 dived during diving practices off Trondheim was given as 120 to 130 meters, or 394 to 427 feet. Prisoners regarded the stay in Trondheim as a continuation of their training, and added that the 24th U-boat flotilla was at Trondheim, as well as a varying numbers of active service U-boats. One 500-ton U-boat was described as having a gray-white snake painted as a badge on her conning tower. The crew of U-501 stated that during this period they lived in a ship named Black Prince, which lay in the Low Fjord, about 2 hours by ferry to the north of Trondheim. Other ships said to have been lying in Low Fjord for the accommodation of U-boat personnel were Hertz and Nisse. NID note: Black Prince is a Norwegian 5,000-ton motor vessel belonging to the Olsen Company. Hertz is believed to be a new U-boat tender. No information is available about Nisse. Section 4. First and last cruise of U-501. Prisoners stated that U-501 left Trondheim on her first and last cruise on 7th August 1941. She carried 6 torpedoes in her tubes, 4 spares under and 2 above the floor plates in the forward compartment, and 2 more spares in the after compartment, making a total of 14. It was stated that the 4 remaining upper deck containers for torpedoes were empty. 12 torpedoes were said to have been electric. while 2 were air torpedoes. Prisoners said that 2 safety islands, Rettoninseln, were carried, 1 forward and 1 aft of the upper deck. These were described as inflatable rafts. U-501 was said to have proceeded north of the Shetlands and Faroes to the area south of Iceland. Prisoners alleged that a few days out, about 12th August 1941, U-501 was attacked by a destroyer or a corvette. The U-boat crash-dived, and the explosions of 12 to 15 depth charges from the British warship were heard rather far off and caused no damage. This attack was described as having occurred about daybreak, and U-501 remained submerged until noon. NID note: HMS Picardy was attacked by a U-boat at 0300 on 12th August in about 62 degrees by 20 north and 18 degrees by 30 west, but since she was sunk, no account is available. It is more probable, however, that this attack refers to HMS Snowdrop, who attacked a U-boat with 2 patterns of 10 depth charges at 0710 on 11th August in 60 degrees by 51 north and 16 degrees by 34 west. The next incident of note was said to have occurred one afternoon about 3 weeks after leaving Trondheim, namely, about the end of August 1941, when U-501, submerged to periscope depth, fired 2 bow torpedoes at a steamer, but both missed. Prisoners complained about the incessant British air reconnaissance, which forced them to spend much time submerged. On one occasion, a young and inexperienced rating did not realize the necessity for rapid submerging, and, according to his comrades, nearly endangered the safety of the U-boat by not getting down off the bridge quickly enough. On one occasion, U-501 was said to have been forced to stay submerged for 2 days, and could not therefore receive any wireless telegraph signals during that time. A somewhat unreliable prisoner claimed that U-501 had intercepted a signal from U-570 consisting of the 3 letters IRA, which it was added meant boat unable to submerge, boat ontaklar. This story could not be confirmed. If true, it would have happened at some time on the 27th or 28th August 1941. Prisoners could not explain why the captain of U-501 took no action in the matter. About noon on 5th September 1941, U-501 attacked the Norwegian ship Einvik, 2,000 tons, from the surface and fired 6 torpedoes at her, of which only 1 hit but failed to sink her. The first 3 torpedoes were fired fan-wise in salvo. The 4th torpedo was fired from the remaining bow tube, while the 5th and 6th were fired from the stern tubes, according to a torpedo rating. Prisoners said that Einvik was sailing independently, as she did not sink, but continued to send out wireless telegraph signals, which the German thought must have been DF'd easily and accurately. U-501 opened fire on her and kept up the shelling until the Norwegian vessel sank. Prisoners estimated that U-501 fired over 40 shells. They believed that Einvik must have been unarmed, as she never returned their fire. At some time on 5th September 1941, U-501 was said to have communicated by lamp with another U-boat, thought by prisoners to have an identity number in their 80s, possibly U-84 or U-87. Prisoners stated on the morning of 10th September 1941, about 24 hours before U-501 was sunk, a signal was received from the Vice Admiral U-boats reporting the position and course of a convoy in the area in which U-501 was operating. It was added that no information was given regarding the number of ships in convoy, nor of the number or types of escorts. The U-boat was said to have proceeded to the southeastward of the convoy and tried to get ahead of it with the intention of lying in wait. Prisoners stated that the U-boat shadowing the convoy reported the course and made a series of signals. Change of course to the east. U-501, coming up from the south, knew that she must cross the path of the convoy, but overshot the mark and went too far to the north, according to prisoners, so altered course 180 degrees to the south and ran right into the convoy. It was stated that about 4 hours before U-501 came up with the convoy, a signal was received from U-432 announcing that she was also in contact with the convoy. Another signal intercepted, apparently somewhat later, was described as being from Olido or Polydor to Max. Olido and Max, or Polydor and Max. NID note. It is known that U-boat captains use their Christian or nicknames in wireless telegraph signals. Prisoners believed that there were several U-boats attempting to attack the convoy. NID note. The convoy was SC-42, which was continuously attacked by U-boats between p.m. 9th September and a.m. 11th September, 14 ships being torpedoed. At about 0200 on 11th September 1941, U-501 was forced to crash dive to avoid being spotted by aircraft. Approximately half an hour later, ASDIC transmissions were heard, but it was not possible to determine from which direction these were coming until the noises of the propellers of the approaching ships were picked up by the hydrophones. Some prisoners blamed the man on duty at the hydrophones for not having picked up these noises sooner. This man, however, gave the impression of being more alert and intelligent than most of the crew. Section 5. Sinking of U-501. HMS Chambly and Moosejaw, who were on a training cruise, were ordered to join and reinforce the escort of convoy SC-42, whilst about 4 miles ahead of the convoy, with which contact had not yet been made, Chambly gained ASDIC contact and dropped 4 depth charges set to 100 feet 1, 150 feet 1, and 250 feet 2. HMS Moosejaw altered course to port and kept clear of the former ship's wake. U-501 was at a depth of 40 meters, or 131 feet, and the explosion of the depth charges caused considerable damage inside the U-boat, a number of instruments being smashed and the after hydroplane being put out of action. Both the ordinary and the emergency lighting systems ceased to function. Prisoners claim to have heard 2 or more crashes in the control room, followed by a smell of gas given off by the action of water on potassium cartridges. The valves of the U-boat were said to have been damaged and the depth gauge was put out of action. Prisoners were positive, however, that no water entered except a small quantity through the water closet forward. Some men said that this was due to burst water pipes leading to the WC. Immediately after the charges had exploded, Moosejaw sighted the U-boat surfacing between herself and Chambly. As U-501 was underway, Moosejaw opened fire on her as soon as Chambly was clear of the range. But the gun jammed after the first round, so Moosejaw increased speed to close the U-boat with the intention of ramming her, and got close alongside. U-501 then altered course, and the 2 ships ran alongside each other. The captain of U-501 promptly jumped on board Moosejaw, and other Germans made a move to do likewise, but Moosejaw, not being prepared to repel boarders, sheered off. The U-boat then appeared to be attempting to cross the corvette's bows, so the latter increased to full speed, then rammed her at an angle of 45 degrees on her starboard bow. The U-boat passed across Moose Jaw's bows at reduced speed, and the latter, having got her gun clear again, opened fire, whereupon the Germans took to the water. Survivors admitted that their 20mm gun on the bridge was ready for action when the U-boat surfaced. Moose Jaw asked Chambly to assist in the rescue of prisoners, as almost the entire ship's company in Moose Jaw were already occupied in pulling them out of the water, and it was therefore impossible to lower a boat. Chambly attempted to go alongside the U-boat and board, but was unable to do so as the diesels were still running and the U-boat going ahead. Chambly therefore sent a boat and boarding party led by the first lieutenant of Chambly, which managed to get on board. U-501 was settling fast, and the first lieutenant of Chambly, who was in the conning tower, was sucked down as the U-boat sank. One stoker of the boarding party was unfortunately lost. It was reported by the boarding party that a large hole was seen about 4 foot in diameter, where the U-boat's casing joined the hull in the port quarter. It appeared that the U-boat's port-after hydroplane had been blown off. Chambly's boat rescued 1 officer and 7 men, while 10 of the crew of U-501 lost their lives. Prisoners were quite certain that the latter were drowned trying to swim from the U-boat to the corvettes, as the entire crew of U-501 got out of the U-boat, which they realized must inevitably sink very quickly indeed. The captain of U-501 explained his precipitate leap from his U-boat by stating that he felt impelled to get aboard Moose Jaw at once in order to insist on the British rescuing his men. Otherwise, he added, the German crew might have been left to drown. His explanation, while failing to convince the British, succeeded in infuriating his own men into a state of high blood pressure. The telegraphist stated positively that no signal announcing the end of U-501 could be sent, as everything was so unexpected and so quick. Prisoners stated that U-501, when sunk, after having been 5 weeks at sea, had only 60 cubic meters of fuel oil left, and had been about to make for Lorient. The normal expenditure of fuel oil appears to be approximately 4 cubic meters per day. Prisoners never practiced refueling at sea and did not believe that such refueling was likely to have been attempted. No tropical clothing was carried, but there were some rumors current among the men that after arrival at Lorient, where they expected a period of rest, they would be sent on a cruise to the U-boat area in the South Atlantic. Section 6. Details of U-501. Remarks on construction. U-501 was a 740-ton Type 9C U-boat, but survivors claimed that her actual tonnage was, in point of fact, in excess of that figure. Some estimates put it as having been almost 900 tons. The thickest ribs of the U-boat were stated to be amidships, where the diameter was largest. Prisoners did not know whether each rib was of the same thickness throughout, or whether some parts of the rib were thicker than the rest. The section of a rib was described as being a double T. Prisoners believed that the plates of the pressure hull were flush and welded. Survivors knew of no special protection of the pressure hull below deck, nor between pressure hull and outer skin or tanks. The keel was described as having been extended aft by a rail intended to give special support to the rudder. This rail was said to have been rigidly fixed to the keel. Prisoners said there was no special anti-fouling protection for the propellers. U-501 was said to have had 8 diving tanks, of which tank number 3 was always used for additional fuel oil. It was added that no oil was ever carried in tanks 1, 5, and 8. It was stated that the U-boat had 4 fuel tanks inside the pressure hull, built into the bilges forward. The space between the hull and the upper deck was believed to have been the same for practically the whole length of the upper deck, and to have been between about 1¼ meters, about 4 feet deep along the center line of the U-boat. In this space, 2 inflatable rafts, a wooden dinghy, ropes and cables were said to have been stored, also a container for ready ammunition. The upper deck was described as being covered with longitudinal slats of wood about 3 inches wide, except for areas right forward and right aft, about 14 or 15 feet and 11 or 12 feet long respectively, which were of metal. The space between the deck and the pressure hull was, of course, flooded when the U-boat was submerged. Prisoners criticized the deck covering as having been too light and too insecurely fixed. Various contradictory statements were made regarding the diving angle of U-501. The consensus of opinion placed the usual diving angle at 4 or 5 degrees. Several prisoners asserted that the angle of a crash dive could be as great as 20 degrees. Engines. Prisoners stated that U-501 was equipped with 2 MAN diesels, each with 2,000 horsepower or over. At utmost speed, the revolutions were given as 400, and at economic speed as between 200 and 300. Armament. U-501 had 4 forward and 2 stern tubes. She carried 6 torpedoes in her tubes and 8 spares inside the U-boat. As stated earlier in this report, she had originally had 10 upper deck containers for torpedoes, but 6 had been removed, leaving 1 container on either side of the conning tower and 1 on either side further aft. Prisoners stated that she carried 1 105mm gun forward, 1 37mm gun aft, capable of being used as an anti-aircraft gun, and 1 20mm gun on the bridge. Survivors complained that the ammunition given them for those guns was all old ammunition manufactured about 1934 and 1935. Protection of hydroplanes. Prisoners said that the hydroplanes were each protected by a horizontal metal bar projecting beyond the outer extremity of the hydroplane. From the outer end of this bar, a cable ran to a point on the hull about 16 feet further aft and acted as a fender against any object which might damage the hydroplane. Wireless telegraphy. Prisoners stated that U-501 had 2 receivers constantly manned, 1 for shortwave. Directional finding was also kept. It was stated that the frequencies of the wireless telegraph transmissions were changed several times daily. The strength of wireless telegraph transmissions was said to be 200 watts. Detector gear. Survivors admitted that although a special space had been left in the wireless telegraph cabin for the detector gear, gerät, this apparatus had not been fitted, but U-501 had hoped to have it installed at a later date. Underwater telephone. U-501 was stated to have been equipped with an underwater telephone, which was worked by the petty officer telegraphist. It was added that under favorable conditions, this could be used up to a distance of 10 miles. Prisoners stated that underwater telephony was used during practices, but otherwise would only be used in a rare, extreme emergency. Potash cartridges. Prisoners said that there were 10 to 15 cartridges, about 25 by 15 centimeters, fixed on the inside of the hull or on the bulkheads. Badge. According to prisoners, new U-boats carrying out trials and practices have a distinguishing mark painted on the conning tower. This mark is later painted out. In the case of U-501, this mark was the ace of spades, which was replaced by the U-boat's permanent badge. The latter was 2 hippopotami heads. A further emblem, a small black cat, was painted on the conning tower, forward on the starboard side. Appendix. List of crew of U-501. Survivors listed with name, rank, English equivalent, and age, etc. And list of those who did not survive, 10. Total crew, officers 6, petty officers 15, men 16, total 47